What happens when the city's most feared crime lord finds a crying baby clinging to his tailored suit in the middle of a deadly cartel meeting? You'd expect violence. Instead, he did something that shocked the entire underworld. This is a story of blood, betrayal, and an unthinkable choice. The Long Island Sound crashed violently against the private cliffs of the Castiglione estate, a sprawling, modern fortress of glass and steel that belonged to a man who owned half of New York's underground economy. To the outside world, Roman Castiglione was a brilliant venture capitalist, a regular at charity galas at the Ritz-Carlton, and a ruthless board member. To those who whispered his name in the shadowed alleys of Brooklyn and the docks of Newark, he was the Don. He was a man composed entirely of sharp edges, calculating precision, and an absolute absence of mercy. Deep within the bowels of Roman's massive estate, far away from the imported Italian marble and the crystal chandeliers, 24-year-old Sarah Hayes scrubbed a copper sink until her knuckles bled. Sarah was invisible by design. In the Castiglione household, maids were strictly instructed to never make eye contact with the family, to vanish into the service corridors when the heavy mahogany doors opened, and to never, under any circumstances, bring their personal lives onto the property. But Sarah had broken the most sacred rule of all. Hidden beneath a pile of freshly laundered linens in the cramped, windowless servants' quarters was a wicker laundry basket. Inside that basket slept her 10-month-old son, Liam. Sarah's life had been a series of tragic, cascading failures brought on by the men she trusted. Her ex-boyfriend, Tommy, had been a low-level runner for a local crew. A year ago, he had skimmed $40,000 from a drop point in Queens and vanished into the wind, leaving Sarah pregnant, utterly alone, and drowning in debt from Liam's premature birth at Mount Sinai Hospital. Desperate to keep a roof over their heads and terrified that the loan sharks would find her, Sarah had secured a position at the estate through an aging housekeeper named Mrs. Higgins. It was dangerous work, but the pay was entirely under the table and generous enough to buy Liam's specialized asthma medication. Usually, Mrs. Higgins watched Liam in her small apartment in the Bronx, while Sarah worked her grueling 12-hour shifts. But a sudden, severe bout of pneumonia had put the older woman in the hospital, leaving Sarah with a devastating choice: skip work and lose the job that was keeping them alive, or smuggle Liam into the lion's den. She chose the latter, slipping him past the perimeter security guards during the chaotic shift change at dawn. As the grandfather clock in the grand foyer struck 10 o'clock at night, the atmosphere in the estate grew suffocating. Tonight was not a normal night. Black armored SUVs had been rolling up the circular driveway since dusk. Roman Castiglione was hosting a summit. Rival factions from Chicago and a brutal Russian syndicate operating out of Brighton Beach were in attendance. The air in the mansion was thick with the smell of Cuban cigars, expensive scotch, and the metallic, unspoken promise of violence. Sarah was exhausted. Her grey uniform clung to her back with sweat as she furiously plated hors d'oeuvres in the massive industrial kitchen. The head chef, a terrifying, heavily tattooed man named Bruno, barked orders in rapid-fire Italian, demanding perfection. Sarah kept her head down, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every 15 minutes, she would excuse herself under the pretense of fetching more supplies from the pantry, slipping down the narrow back staircase to check on Liam. Down in the dim, damp servants' room, Liam was a miracle of a child. He was quiet, a survival trait he seemed to have inherited from his mother. He sat in his laundry basket, chewing happily on a soft plastic block, his bright blue eyes wide and curious. "Just a little longer, baby," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside the basket and kissing his warm forehead. Her hands shook as she brushed a stray curl of brown hair from his face. "Mummy's almost done. Then we go home, and I'll sing you to sleep. I promise." She left him with a bottle of formula propped up on a rolled towel, securely wedged the door shut, or so she thought, and sprinted back up the stairs. The summit was reaching a critical point. Sarah was handed a heavy silver tray of crystal tumblers and a bottle of Macallan that cost more than her entire year's rent. She was instructed to deliver it to the library, the absolute epicenter of the estate. "Keep your eyes on the floor," Bruno hissed, shoving the tray into her trembling hands. "Pour the drinks. Do not speak. If you drop so much as an ice cube, you won't live to see the sunrise." Sarah nodded frantically, her throat dry. She balanced the tray and walked down the long, silent corridor leading to the West Wing. The walls were lined with Renaissance paintings, but all Sarah could see was the heavy oak double doors at the end of the hall. Two massive guards, armed with submachine guns, strapped tight to their chests, patted her down roughly before swinging the doors open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a roaring fireplace. Roman Castiglione sat at the head of a long, polished table. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, his dark hair flawlessly styled, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Opposite him sat Dmitri Volkov, a massive, scarred man who controlled the eastern seaboard's illegal arms trade. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on Sarah's chest as she stepped inside. She moved like a ghost, pouring the amber liquid into the glasses, her hands miraculously steady despite the sheer terror coursing through her veins. She could hear the low, dangerous hum of their conversation, words about shipping containers, percentages, and territorial borders. As she finished pouring Roman's drink, she risked a fraction of a glance upward. Roman's eyes locked onto hers for a microsecond. They were the color of storm clouds, cold and piercing. Sarah immediately dropped her gaze, her breath hitching, and backed away toward the door. She bowed her head, slipped out of the room, and let the heavy doors click shut behind her. She had survived. But as she hurried back down the service stairs to finally take her break, a cold, paralyzing dread washed over her. The door to her small servant's room was pushed ajar. Sarah dropped the silver tray. It clattered against the concrete floor, echoing loudly in the stairwell. She threw the door open, her heart stopping completely. The laundry basket was empty. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through Sarah's chest. She dropped to her knees, frantically searching beneath the narrow cot, behind the water heater, and inside the cramped supply closet. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Liam, please, baby. Where are you?" Silence answered her. The basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms, wine cellars, and long, shadowy corridors. If Liam had crawled out, he could be anywhere. But what truly froze the blood in her veins was the realization that the service elevator, which led directly up to the west wing of the mansion, was currently sitting on the basement floor with its grate slightly open. Liam had been pulling himself up on furniture for weeks. He was fast, curious, and utterly fearless. Sarah didn't think. She ran. She threw herself up the main service stairs, ignoring the burning in her lungs. She had to find him before one of the guards did. The men patrolling this house were not the kind to gently return a lost child to his mother. They were enforcers, trained to eliminate anomalies and threats without question. Meanwhile, back in the Grand Library, the negotiations had deteriorated into a venomous standoff. Dmitri Volkov leaned over the mahogany table, a sneer twisting his scarred face. "You overstep, Castiglione," the Russian rumbled, his thick accent coating the threat. "The docks in Brooklyn belong to us. You think you can push us out just because you wear a nice suit and play the businessman?" Roman didn't blink. He slowly swirled the scotch in his glass, leaning back in his leather chair. "I don't think, Dmitri. I know. Your operation is sloppy. You draw federal attention. You leave bodies in the streets. I run a business, you run a circus. The containers will reroute through my ports starting Monday. You will take a 15% cut, and you will say thank you." Dmitri's face flushed a violent crimson. The 3 Russian bodyguards standing behind him instinctively reached inside their jackets. The air crackled with lethal intent. Roman's own men, standing perfectly still in the corners of the room, had their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. A single loud noise would turn the library into a slaughterhouse. And then a tiny high-pitched squeal echoed from the floorboards near the heavy oak doors. Every hardened killer in the room froze. Dmitri's hand paused on the grip of his pistol. Roman slowly lowered his glass. Crawling out from underneath a heavy velvet curtain that covered a secondary service entrance was Liam. He was wearing a slightly oversized, faded yellow onesie adorned with cartoon ducks. He patted the hardwood floor with his small hands, looking around the room filled with armed, dangerous men with absolute, innocent wonder. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. The Russian bodyguards exchanged bewildered glances. Roman stared at the child, his jaw tightening, completely processing the sheer absurdity of the situation. Liam spotted the most interesting thing in the room, the shiny, polished toe of Roman's Oxford shoes. Babbling a string of incomprehensible syllables, the baby crawled quickly across the expensive Persian rug, completely ignoring the guns and the tension, and made a beeline straight for the Don. "What in the hell is this?" Dmitri growled, looking from the baby to Roman, his suspicion flaring. He thought it was a trick, some bizarre distraction tactic. "Is this a joke, Castiglione?" Before Roman could speak, Liam reached his chair. The baby pulled himself up, grabbing onto the sharp crease of Roman's impeccably tailored Tom Ford trousers, and stood on his wobbly legs. Liam looked up at the terrifying Mafia boss, gave a wide, toothless grin, and slapped Roman's knee. "Da-da!" Liam babbled happily. Roman Castiglione, a man who had ordered the execution of rival bosses without a flinch, who had single-handedly rebuilt an empire from blood and ashes, looked down at the tiny creature clinging to his leg, completely stunned. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing pure, unadulterated bewilderment. At that exact moment, the library doors burst open. Sarah flew into the room, her apron stained, her hair a wild mess, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked like madness. "No!" Sarah screamed, launching herself forward. She didn't care about the guns that instantly snapped in her direction. She didn't care about the lethal men surrounding her. She only saw her son touching the most dangerous man in New York. "Get away from him!" a guard yelled, rushing toward Sarah and aggressively grabbing her by the hair, dragging her violently to the floor. Liam, seeing his mother thrown to the ground, burst into hysterics. He clung tighter to Roman's leg, burying his face into the expensive wool fabric, sobbing loudly. Dmitri suddenly laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. The tension broke, but not in a good way. The Russian boss stood up, drawing his weapon and aiming it carelessly in the general direction of Sarah and the crying infant. "Your security is a joke, Roman," Dmitri mocked, stepping around the table. "A filthy maid and a bastard child interrupt a commission meeting. It shows weakness. It shows you lack control over your own house. Maybe I should clean up your mess for you to show you how a real boss handles disruptions." Dmitri cocked the hammer of his gun, pointing it squarely at Sarah's head as she wept on the floor. Desperately reaching out for Liam, Sarah closed her eyes, waiting for the gunshot. She prayed that Liam would somehow survive, that someone in this room had a shred of humanity left. Then, the unthinkable happened. Roman did not call his guards. He did not order Sarah dragged out. Instead, Roman reached down with large, steady hands and gently picked Liam up. The baby immediately wrapped his tiny arms around Roman's neck, hiding his tear-streaked face in the collar of the Don's shirt. Roman held the child securely against his chest with his left arm. With his right hand, in a movement so fast it blurred, Roman drew the heavy Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster and fired a single shot. The deafening crack echoed through the library. Dmitri Volkov's eyes went wide. He collapsed backward, a perfectly centered hole between his eyes, hitting the floor dead before his weapon even clattered away. Chaos erupted, but before the Russian guards could even unholster their weapons, Roman's men had them completely surrounded, guns pressed firmly to the backs of their heads. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence again, broken only by the muffled sniffling of the baby clinging to the crime lord. Sarah opened her eyes, trembling violently, staring at the dead body of the Russian boss, and then up at Roman. The Don stood tall, the gun still smoking in his hand, the baby resting safely against his chest. Roman looked down at Sarah, his cold, storm cloud eyes locking onto hers once more. He holstered his weapon, adjusted his grip on the infant to support Liam's head, and looked coldly at the remaining, terrified Russian guards. "You tell your people in Brighton Beach," Roman said, his voice a low, lethal baritone that sent shivers down Sarah's spine, "that Dmitri made a fatal error. He threatened my family." The room spun. Sarah gasped, the world tilting violently on its axis. Did he just claim them? Roman looked back down at the terrified Maid on the floor. "Get up," he ordered softly. Not as a master to a servant, but as something entirely different. "Get up. We have a lot to discuss." The heavy oak doors of the library slammed shut, cutting off the frantic shouts of the cleaning crew dealing with Dimitri's remains. Sarah sat rigidly on the edge of a custom-made Italian leather sofa in Roman Castiglione's private penthouse suite. The room smelled of cedarwood, expensive parchment, and gunpowder. Liam, completely exhausted from the adrenaline and the crying, had fallen asleep on the massive California king bed, safely barricaded by down pillows. Roman poured a fresh glass of Macallan. He didn't offer her one. Instead, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, exposing the shoulder holster, still strapped tightly over his pristine white shirt, and sat opposite her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Sarah could no longer bear it. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. "Why did you say that? Why did you kill him?" Roman took a slow sip of his drink. His storm cloud eyes analyzed her, peeling back her layers of fear and exhaustion to see the fierce, desperate mother underneath. Dmitri Volkov was a rabid dog. He was bad for business, and I have been looking for an excuse to eliminate him for 6 months without triggering an all-out war with the Bratva in Brighton Beach. The old rules of the syndicate are strict, Sarah. You cannot murder a seated boss over a business dispute. But if a boss threatens a Don's family, his wife and his heir, that is a justified execution. The Russians cannot retaliate without breaking the code themselves. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The sheer, calculating coldness of his logic was terrifying. "So, we're just an alibi, a shield." "At first, yes," Roman admitted, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "When Dmitri pointed that weapon at you, the tactical advantage materialized perfectly, in my mind. But..." He paused, glancing toward the bed where Liam slept peacefully. A strange, unfamiliar shadow flickered across the crime lord's face. "When your son touched me, I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time, an instinct to protect." Sarah let out a bitter, shaky laugh. "You're a mob boss. You kill people for a living." "I protect what is mine," Roman corrected sharply, his voice dropping an octave, sending a shiver down her spine. "And as of tonight, to the entire underworld of New York City, you and that boy are mine. If you leave this estate, the Bratva will hunt you down to test the truth of my claim. The only place you are safe is by my side. From this moment on, you are no longer Sarah Hayes, the invisible maid. You are Sarah Castiglione." The next 3 weeks were a surreal nightmare wrapped in luxury. Sarah was moved out of the damp basement and into the master suite's adjoining room. She was given a limitless platinum American Express card, a wardrobe of designer clothes from Bergdorf Goodman, and a detail of heavily armed guards who followed her every time she stepped onto the estate's sprawling gardens. To the outside world, Roman played the part of the devoted, secretive family man perfectly. He would occasionally hold Liam during accidental photo opportunities when his blacked-out Maybach pulled out of the gates, ensuring the rumors circulated through the streets of Brooklyn and Queens. But behind closed doors, their relationship was a tense, silent dance. Roman was distant, drowning in the chaotic fallout of the power vacuum Dimitri's death had created. Yet, there were moments that shattered the illusion of his icy exterior. Late at night, Sarah would sometimes catch Roman standing in the doorway of Liam's nursery. The ruthless Don would watch the baby sleep, his hardened jaw relaxed, a look of profound longing in his eyes. Once, when Liam had a terrible asthma flare-up, Roman had fired the on-call estate doctor for being 5 minutes late, holding the oxygen mask to Liam's tiny face himself with a gentleness that made Sarah's heart ache. She was beginning to see the man beneath the monster. But the past was not finished with Sarah. The twist came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was sitting in the conservatory, reading a book while Liam played on a Persian rug, when the head of security, a hulking Irishman named Declan, walked in. His face was grim. "Mr. Castiglione needs you in the secure bunker immediately, ma'am," Declan said, his hand resting on his earpiece. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, scooping Liam up. "We have a perimeter breach, and it's complicated." When Sarah hurried into the subterranean bunker, a room filled with surveillance monitors and weapons, she found Roman staring at a live feed from the front gates, the color drained entirely from Sarah's face. Standing in the pouring rain, demanding to be let in, was Tommy, her ex-boyfriend. The man who had stolen $40,000, abandoned her, and left her to die. But Tommy wasn't alone. He was flanked by heavily armed men bearing the tattoos of the Sullivan Syndicate, a ruthless Irish mob faction from Boston. "He heard the rumors," Roman said coldly, his eyes locked on the screens. "He found out the bastard child the Castiglione Don claimed as his heir is actually his biological son. The Sullivans are using him to extort me. They want a massive cut of my ports, or Tommy goes to the Bratva and tells them our marriage is a sham, proving I broke the code when I killed Dimitri." Sarah felt the room spin. Tommy had returned not out of love, but to sell them out. He was going to get them all killed. Roman turned to face Sarah. The cold, calculating businessman was gone. In his place was the apex predator, the undisputed king of the New York underworld. "I am going to ask you a question, Sarah," Roman said, stepping dangerously close to her. The smell of cedarwood and impending violence rolled off him. "And your answer will determine the fate of everyone outside those gates. Do you still love him?" Sarah looked at the monitors, at the pathetic, greedy man who had left her starving and terrified in a freezing apartment while she was pregnant. Then she looked at Roman, the man who had taken them in, who had shot a Russian warlord to save them, who stayed up at night listening to her son's breathing to make sure he was safe. "No," Sarah said, her voice steady and hard for the first time in her life. "He is nothing to me. Liam is his blood. But you are the only father he has ever known." Something inside Roman fractured. The heavy, invisible wall he had kept between them shattered entirely. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. It was the most intimate contact they had shared. "Then they die," Roman whispered. The battle was swift and brutally absolute. Roman did not send his men to do his dirty work. He led the charge himself. From the security monitors, Sarah covered Liam's eyes and watched as the gates were opened. Tommy and the Sullivan men stepped inside, expecting a negotiation. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. Gunfire erupted, tearing through the rain. Roman moved with terrifying, lethal precision. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Within 3 minutes, the Boston enforcers were dead on the wet asphalt. Tommy was the last one standing, crawling backward in the mud, begging for his life as Roman casually walked toward him, reloading his weapon. "Wait! Castiglione, wait!" Tommy sobbed, holding his hands up. "He's my kid! I have rights! You can't do this!" Roman stood over him, the rain washing the blood from his tailored suit. "You lost your rights the day you left them to starve," Roman said, his voice carrying over the storm. "He is my son, and she is my wife." Roman pulled the trigger. When Roman finally returned to the bunker, he was soaked, battered, and smelled of copper and rain. He handed his weapon to Declan and walked straight toward Sarah. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her and Liam tightly against his chest. Sarah buried her face in his neck, the adrenaline crashing down on her, bringing a flood of tears. She gripped his ruined suit, anchoring herself to him. "It's over," Roman murmured against her hair, his breath shaky. The Don, the untouchable ghost of New York, was trembling. "No one will ever hurt you again. Either of you. I swear it on my life." They had started as an alibi, a desperate maid, and a ruthless crime lord thrown together by the chaotic innocence of a child. But as Roman held them in the secure bunker beneath the glass fortress, the lie became the truth. The poor maid had melted the heart of the Mafia boss, and the child who crawled under a velvet curtain had given the king of the underworld a reason to live for something more than power. Months later, they stood on the cliffs overlooking the Long Island Sound. The storms had passed. Sarah wore a simple, elegant white dress, and on her finger rested a diamond the size of a robin's egg. Liam was babbling happily, sitting securely on Roman's broad shoulders, pulling at the Don's perfectly styled hair. Roman just smiled, a real, genuine smile, and pulled Sarah in for a kiss. The underworld would always be watching, but in the Castiglione estate, love had conquered blood. Did this gripping story of survival, mafia betrayal, and unexpected love keep you on the edge of your seat? Sometimes the most ruthless hearts are tamed by the most innocent souls. If you loved Roman and Sarah's intense journey, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love mafia romance, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories.